Thank you very much. And now we have a rebuttal from Dr. Craig, please.
We've agreed in tonight's debate that a belief in God is not essential to living a moral life. But my argument is that without the existence of God, there would not be moral values, moral duties, or moral accountability in any objective sense. Dr. Kurtz asks, well, if you can live a moral life without belief in God, then how is God essential? Well, very simply, without God, there is no foundation, I believe, and have argued, for objective values, duties, and accountability. Dr. Kurtz himself writes in his book, Forbidden Fruit, the central question about moral and ethical principles concerns their ontological foundation, that is to say, their basis in reality. If they are neither derived from God nor anchored in some transcendent ground, are they purely ephemeral? That's the question that is before us this evening. And Dr. Kurtz must show that in the absence of God, human beings would in fact have intrinsic moral value, moral duties, and he must supply some sort of moral accountability. And I don't think that he can do that. That's why God is essential, to provide a foundation or a basis for the affirmation of these elements of the moral life. Why is this important? Well, because it's not obvious to me that if God doesn't exist, that humanism would be true. On the contrary, it seems very plausible to think that if God does not exist, nihilism would be true. And this is important because Dr. Kurtz admits in his book that nihilism is not enough for the foundation of the moral life. He writes, no one can consistently live his or her life under the domination of such an attitude, that is nihilism. So it is impossible to live the individual moral life from a nihilistic view. Also, it undermines the moral fabric of society. He writes, common moral decencies lay down moral imperatives necessary for group cohesion and survival. So if nihilism is true, we lack those objective moral principles that is necessary for the moral fabric of society. So I think it's critical in tonight's debate that Dr. Kurtz address the question, why, if there is no God, wouldn't nihilism be true? Now, I argued two things in my first speech. First, that if theism is true, we have a sound foundation for morality. Dr. Kurtz didn't dispute that if theism is true, there would be objective moral values, objective moral duties, and moral accountability. But he did bring in several red herrings, I think, to try to distract us from the central issue. He said, for example, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? Notice that this is a question about the existence of God, and we're not arguing that here tonight. This is not a debate on the existence of God. My claim is a conditional one. If theism is true, then we have a sound foundation for morality. So even if he is right, that wouldn't prove that God would not be a sound foundation for morality if theism is true. Secondly, in addition to that, I would simply say that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world, and then it's going to be Dr. Kurtz that bears the burden of proof to show that that's either impossible or improbable. So I don't think that the problem of evil is at the heart of the debate tonight. It's a red herring. Similarly, it's also a red herring to say, well, which God exists and what does he command? These are questions of moral epistemology, not moral ontology. That is to say, these are questions about how we know the good or how we discover God's commands, but they are not about what is the basis, the ontological foundation for moral values, duties, and so forth. Indeed, I would say once we have arrived at the conclusion that if theism is true, you have an objective basis for morality, then it's very important to find out which God exists. Because as Dr. Kurtz said, not all gods are the same. There are some religions in the world that have very vicious concepts of God. And so it's important for us to discover which theism is true. But that's a secondary question to the one that faces us tonight. So I don't think that Dr. Kurtz has said anything to refute my first contention, that if theism is true, then we have a sound foundation for objective moral values, duties, and moral accountability. Now, what about my second contention, that if theism is false, there's no sound foundation for morality? I asked him, what is the basis of objective moral values if there is no God? Human beings are just like other animal species. He says, well, that doesn't mean if God doesn't exist that we would all be despots. There can be standards which are relative to human needs and desires. Right. They're relative to human needs and desires, and therefore they are not unconditional, objective, categorical moral principles or standards. There's no more reason to think that this herd morality evolved by Homo sapiens as a result of the evolutionary process is objectively true than to think that, say, guinea pig morality or horse morality, which is relative to the needs and values of those species, would be objectively true. The question is, why think that human beings and their values are special on an atheistic view? And I don't think he's been able to give us one. Peter Haas, in his book Morality After Auschwitz, uses Nazi Germany as an illustration of the problem we face. He points out that far from being contemptuous of ethics, the perpetrators of the Holocaust acted in strict conformity with an ethic that held that however difficult or unpleasant the task might have been, the mass extermination of the Jews and Gypsies was entirely justified. The Holocaust was possible only because a new ethic was in place that did not define the arrest and deportation of Jews as wrong, and in fact defined it as ethically tolerable and even good. Moreover, Haas points out, because of its internal consistency and coherence, the Nazi ethic couldn't be discredited from within. It could only be pronounced false if you have a transcendent vantage point from which you can transcend socio-cultural relativism and say that this society's values are wrong. They are objectively wrong. But on humanism, there isn't any basis for that because moral values are simply the spin-offs of socio-cultural evolution, and there's no way to judge that one is objectively right and one is objectively wrong. Similarly, with objective moral duties, we saw that animals don't have moral obligations to each other. Massimo Pigliucci, who is a biologist, writes, what we call homicide or rape or even infanticide is very, very common among different types of animals. Lions, for example, commit infanticide on a regular basis. Now, are these kinds of acts to be condoned, he asks? I don't even know what that means because the lion doesn't understand what morality is. Morality is an invention of human beings. There is no such thing, he says, as objective morality. So if moral values are simply inventions of human beings rooted in sociobiological evolution, there's no reason to think that we're obligated to follow it. Similarly, in any case, there's no basis for moral accountability on atheism for these moral values and duties. The thing that is important about moral accountability is that it makes our moral choices significant. In the absence of moral accountability, our choices become trivialized because they make no ultimate contribution to either the betterment of the universe or the moral good in general, because everyone ends up the same. Death is the great leveler. So it seems to me that Dr. Kurtz still faces this crucial challenge to show us why, if there is no God, humanism would be true rather than nihilism.